Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining our weekly podcast. I'm Robin Lewis, founder and CEO of the Robin Report, which, by the way, I keep saying this every week, it's really much more than just a daily report. It is truly a knowledge platform from which we communicate thought leadership on various strategic topics, through the reports, but also these podcasts. We also do webinars and live events, hopefully, since the pandemic is leaving us. Anyway, along with our chief strategist, Shelley Kohan, also a professor at FIT and Syracuse University, we welcome you to our conversation on the topic today of transitory inflation, ? No. It's going to be long term. So, Shelley, first of all, neither me or you are economists, of course. But we did tap into a very prominent, actually world-renowned economist, Charles Goodhart, who says inflation will stay high for decades. A very interesting perspective. This inflation, AKA more demand than there is supply, is not the typical one-off event like prior inflations. The pandemic, the supply chain collapse, and now the war in Ukraine, they all contributed to this inflation. And as we know, Jerome Powell who's head of the Fed, at first claimed inflation would be transitory, right? Then he followed with raising interest rates, which I think yesterday he made the first a quarter percent. And he's going to continue to do this more aggressively, according to him. But now, he is listening and taking pause, as are central bankers and economists around the world. As Goodhart writes in his co-authored book, The Great Demographic Reversal, this is not like past inflations. His point is that this is a democratic-driven inflation that cannot be reversed in the short term with, Volcker-like rate increases during the 70s inflation. Goodhart sees a decades-long era of inexpensive labor giving way to years of worker shortages and higher prices. So when the global economy collapsed early in 2020, the rate of inflation was heading to zero, at that time. But at that time, Goodhart predicted that inflation would rise to between 5 and 10% and would stay high, as I said, for decades. And this shift to an inflationary era would only be hastened by the huge fiscal stimulus and the post-pandemic recovery. And for the last 30 to 40 years, there was a glut of inexpensive labor, as we know. Think China and Eastern Europe, as well as other low-cost countries. But now, it's the beginning of the era of worker shortages, which is driving higher prices. And he said the coronavirus pandemic will mark the dividing line between the deflationary forces of the last 30 to 40 years and the resurgent inflation of the next 2 decades. He predicted that inflation in the advanced economies will settle at 3 to 4% around the end of this year, actually, and remain at that level for decades, compared with about 1.5% in the decade before the pandemic. So, Shelley, can you expand on this thesis a little bit about how shifting demographics are squeezing the labor force and pushing up prices is being digested by central banks around the world?
Well, I think some of the basis of this shift of thinking around transitory inflation versus a more persistent inflation all started when the recovery from the pandemic was not as swift as what was anticipated initially. So many in our industry believed that the pandemic would be short-lived, under a year, about a year, and that we would easily bounce back to the glory days of pre-pandemic life. Well, this has not happened. And here we are 2 years later, and we're still talking about emerging from the ashes of the pandemic. There are many indicators that are telling us that we are in this inflationary bubble for a long time. And as you said, Jerome Powell, who was an ardent believer of transitory inflation, has really stopped talking about it being short-lived. Let's stick to the facts of what we actually do know. So the consumer price index showed an increase of 0.8% for February. This is not new information. This is on top of the rising in January of 0.6. So if we look at this 12-month kind of period, U.S. consumer prices have risen 7.9%. Energy is up 25.8%.
Wow, yeah.
For the rolling year. This will certainly impact discretionary spending on fashion goods, and gasoline is up 38% on that rolling 12-month year. That's going to impact, obviously, transportation of goods and also supply chain, not to mention impact of discretionary spending. So consumers spending at the pump are going to have less money to spend on, fashion goods, so to speak. Apparel pricing is up 6.6%. Men's is up 8.6%. Women's is up 6%. Footwear is up 7%. Food is up almost 8%. Furniture is up almost 18%. And even when we kind of look around the nation, regionally, the South is up 8.4% in terms of the consumer price index. The Midwest is up 8%. The West is up 8.1%. Least hit from inflationary pricing is the Northeast, up 6.6%. So all these pricing increases, don't even take into account what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, the impact of the war on the rest of the economy, and specifically the impact on global energies, food, commodities, and of course, supply chain.
Yeah. And Shelley, regarding Goodhart's great demographic reversal thesis, can you give us a little bit more context on that?
Sure. Well, the labor shortage is a real issue, and we've seen this since the pandemic. The participation rate, so this is the percent of the population that's over 16 years of age that participates in the labor market. It's still under pre-pandemic levels. So in 2019, the year ended with a 63% participation rate. At the end of last year, 2021, it was 61.7%. So just to kind of put some context there, in 2000, the employment rate, the participation rate was 64%, a 30-year high. And right after the financial crisis in 2008, for 2009 and 2010, that participation rate dropped to 58.5%. And during the pandemic, it sunk even lower to 56.8%. So what we're seeing is, that there are less workers that are participating in the workforce. So if we look at October 2021, there were 2.7 million less workers in the U.S. labor force. Wow. I know. And that's compared to pre-pandemic levels. We've seen that number come down a lot. So in February, I think it was about 500,000. So people are, kind of getting back to work, so to speak. And as you had mentioned earlier, Robin, the birth rates are certainly declining. They're declining about 6% since 2015. And we've seen a decline every year except one in 2014 since 2008. So the birth rate keeps going down and down.
There you go. Yeah.
Yep, it's a real. And so, Robin, you'll appreciate this. You won't believe this. Gen Z has been in the workforce for 10 years.
Wow.
It's unbelievable. So they are between 10 and 25 years old. So, half plus are in the workforce. Millennials are in their peak earning years. They're about 26 to 41. Gen X is 42 to 57. Most are in the workforce, but they're thinking about retirement, but they're unsure if they have enough money to actually retire. Boomers are 58 to 76. A lot of those are working, quote unquote, gig jobs. And then the silent generation is over 76. And by the way, some of the silent generation is in the workforce. I think Goodhart's 84. So obviously he's still working.
Right.
But according to the US Census Bureau, by 2030, all baby boomers are going to be at least 65 years old. So the increasing share of people age 65 and older contributes to a projected labor force growth rate that is slower than what we've seen in recent history. So as well as continued decline in the labor force participation rate, because older people participate less in the workforce than younger age groups. Many experts believe labor shortages are going to last several more years, and some say it's actually permanent. So the Wall Street Journal, they surveyed 52 credible economists. Of the 52, 22 of those economists predicted that participation would never return to its pre-pandemic level.
There you go. Yeah.
And keep in mind, Robin, when we discuss the labor participation rates, we have to consider this major shift amongst workers who are choosing to work less, work differently, not work, or work gig jobs. So people are really starting to choose a home life over a career. They're choosing to work less. A lot of people are just starting their own business, right? So we have seen a growth in small businesses and gig workers. The gig economy is going to go from 200 billion to over 450 billion in the next few years.
Unbelievable.
I know, it's unbelievable. So these are part-time workers that just work many jobs in smaller increments. So, and this doesn't even, we're not even discussing the people that are entering the re-commerce business. So selling previously owned items and making a business out of it. So I recently interviewed the vice president of buyer experience at eBay, which, by the way, just posted 17% increase in revenues in 2021. eBay now does over 10 billion. And he suggested this whole re-commerce category is going to continue to grow. Reuse, resell, sustainable model. And of course, we know that used clothing stores were up 10% in 2021. So the point here is that the US market may never get back to the employment rates that are or were consistently over 63% in the near future. The magic 8-ball says doubtful.
This resell reminds me of, when I was growing up, no way could my mother have me wear my older brother's jeans after he grew out of them. And now there's a whole industry on this stuff.
It's a whole business. People are literally quitting their jobs and say, I'm just going to sell everything in my house. At some point, I guess you run out of things to sell. I don't know, maybe a trade back and forth, but.
Yeah. So, our own Federal Reserve Chairman, Jerome Powell, referenced Goodhart's book, by the way, at the annual gathering of central bankers in Jackson Hole, Wyoming last August, where they have it every year. And it was at that time when he actually disagreed with Goodhart's central premise. And when he called the inflation, of course, transitory, quote unquote. However, as we know, recently he did back off on calling this inflation transitory and committed to a series of rate increases this year.
Yeah, I mean, we've certainly heard about, the massive labor shortages around the world. And it's, this demographic shift is really, something that we have to think about. So if we look at like the top 5 major labor force countries, they're all down. China's down 1.8% of their labor force. India's down 4.6. US and Europe are down 1.2. And Indonesia is down 1.5. And those are the top highest.
Yeah. I mean, but wait 1 second, Shelley. I don't understand that India number down 4.5% because they are one of the countries that has the lowest age. The percentage of their population are at young ages.
That's right.
It's supposed to be huge. So is that minus 4.6% due to the pandemic over there?
Yes, those are the numbers. So that's saying pre-pandemic versus the 2020 numbers of the pandemic. So will India bounce back at a greater scale? Probably because, like you said, a significant portion, I know it's north of 40%. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but a very large proportion, as you said, of their workforce is in that kind of peak earning period years.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, if Goodhart's thesis rings true, then it seems to me that the central banks would need to address inflation in a more aggressive way. In fact, the European Central Bank, during its rate setting meeting, actually discussed that very point. Their chief economist did echo Goodhart's thesis, saying that inflation could very well remain high even after the pandemic leaves. And referring to the aging population in China and other countries, Goodhart had a tenure at the Bank of England as an expert in monetarism. In short, it defines inflation as an excess amount of money sloshing around in circulation, right? But then in a later role in the creation of the bank's monetary policy committee, Goodhart posited that the link between too much money causing inflation was not reliable. And of course, that led to the UK abandoning a money supply targets. The European Central Bank said that Goodhart's thesis was initially met with a lot of skepticism. But then the unprecedented economic reaction to the pandemic, followed by the supply chain mess, inflation hit the economy big time and forcing economists and central banks to consider Goodhart's thesis more seriously.
Right. And Robin, as this worker shortage grows, the ability to fill the jobs becomes a significant, challenge, especially when you're trying to secure top talent. So this will surely impact, unfortunately, employment costs. So we discussed this in our podcast, I Quit, the rise of employee power. But employment costs are rising. And we've seen this since Q4 of 2019. So when we look at wages and salaries in the last quarter of 2021, employment costs were up 1.1%. This is on top of Q3's increase of 1.5%. So when we break it down by sector, retail in particular was hit especially hard at almost triple the total of all industries, at an increase in employment costs of 3% for quarter 4 and 1.7% in quarter 3. And even if we factor in wholesale trade was up 1.8% and 1.1% for the last 2 quarters of 2021, but they had a huge hit in Q2 where their employment costs went up 2.4%.
Well, yeah, well, you've got all of this demand, all this money chasing, a shortage of goods, but the retailers have to keep a certain level of a number of associates and people that work for them, so I can begin to understand those percentages. And as we see the rising employment costs, rising product costs, supply chain pricing, and we have yet to see the impact that the war in Ukraine is going to have on additional costs around the world. It could really be a mess. So, retailers really gone from running a normal business operation back in 2019 to actually dealing with one crisis after another. I mean, it's been a merry-go-round of issues, and it is not seeming to stop. And I don't know, and neither is the escalation of the price of goods. Yeah, inflation is here to stay for a while. So what should the industry be doing, or what are they doing?
Well, certainly, many retailers understand that the inputs have to change. The dynamics of our industry are not going to push forward lower pricing or simplified process. Companies really have to really get out there, create action and innovation to survive. I think the discount stores and warehouse clubs have already figured this out. Department stores, they always seem to be tracking a bit behind. And specialty stores, are really all over the map in terms of being able to pivot towards a more financially sustainable future. I see beauty kind of at the top doing a lot of innovative things, and I see apparel at the bottom in terms of, staying ahead of this innovation. So if you think about some of the key initiatives to combat long-term inflationary pricing or to deal with the worker shortage, that's why people like Brian Cornell and Walmart, they've been using robotics for many years. And initially, remember, 5-6 years ago, a lot of workers were so concerned that robots were going to take their job away. But actually, robotics can actually fill the gap of the labor shortages and help. And, the discount stores have been a bit ahead of that, more so than I think others in the industry, in terms of, using robotics to help fill, normal, ordinary tasks, and then taking the people, the actual humans, and having them work at tasks that can better put forth innovation, selling, all those other things. So
it's a very good point, Shelley. Yeah.
So I think
robotics. Yeah,
I think that's a key initiative. Other things are, driving loyalty. There's been a lot with loyalty programs and, making sure that the consistency across all the platforms, are really synergistic. I think we saw a big switch of that post-pandemic, where retailers hopped on with that, driving innovation, hiring diverse teams, diverse thinking, reducing COGS, cost of goods sold, whether that means reducing production costs, reducing SKU assortments, right? We heard Pete Nordstrom talk about that at the NRF show. Strategic partnerships, having more strategic partnerships and really lessening the inventory holdings. And of course, operating expenses. The number one operating expenses for all retailers is employment. And so if you're becoming employer of choice because of the labor shortage, we really have to think about the impact of that on the financials as well. Higher engaged workers are less turnover, which can save money if you have less employees turning over, and less room for trade unions, as well. So I could go on, but the need to reduce the product cost and operating expenses is real. And if gone unchecked, will certainly eliminate more retailers from the landscape.
Oh, Shelley, all of those were great points that you bring out. Guess what? And I guess that's why you are a strategist, right? But anyway, let me ask you this. Are not all of these suggestions to fight inflation, are they not strategies that all businesses should be doing day in and day out, regardless of inflation?
They should be.
Yeah, and back to Goodhart's thesis, really to state it simply, in the developed world, including the US, we simply are not having enough babies to replace the older generations that are leaving, either retiring or dying. Thus, what we end up with is lower productivity and inflation being with us for, as Goodhart said, a long time. Speaking of which, this is an interesting thing. China, think about this, is going to be bitten by their own one-child policy, which it was incredible, particularly in a country, huge population. Anyway, this demographic fact, unlike just too much demand chasing too little supply, which characterized past inflations that were brought down by the, I guess, Volcker-like hammer of raising the Fed's rate, the demographic reality of not enough working bodies could last years and inordinately cause higher prices. In fact, high prices could set a new level of pricing that really could last forever.
Well put, Robin. Unfortunately, we're out of time now, but that was an excellent closing. For our listeners, you can find more of our podcast on Apple, Spotify, Buzzsprout, and of course, therobinreport.com. Look for us on YouTube, where we broadcast our podcast as well. And please follow us on social media, link in with us, follow us on Twitter for the latest thoughts about the industry.
Yeah, and I want to thank our listeners and viewers one last time for joining us. And also, as I say every week, if any of you have topics that you've been thinking about and you would like Shelley and I to cover in one of these podcasts, just send me an email to Robin at therobinreport.com. And thanks again.